Welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss terrorism challenges in South Asia, a regional perspective. Terrorism is a complex but not recent phenomena, and given the complexities the term terrorism carries both with its definition and its strategic aspect, has already hampered the geo-economic pivot to Asia. Threats that were earlier contained within national boundaries have now become transnational challenges, and at times with consent of the political actors. As it stands, there is no concrete definition of the concept, owing to a variety of factors, including the claim that what one person calls terrorism, another might call liberation. The latter especially seems to be characteristics of the Israel-Palestinian context, as some scholars note. However, in the contemporary context, it is also characteristic of what has been dubbed as revolutionary terrorism, when formerly colonized societies engaged in violence in seeking independence from European colonial empires during the mid-20th century. Such episodes of mass slaughter as the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide proved the potency of ideology and organization as motors for unspeakable horrors. And beneath killings on a genocidal scale, there is still the problem posed by highly brutal states, be they totalitarian, sultanistic or collapsing, whose rulers seek to use violence to stave off their own demise. As well as using terror, states have on occasion fueled the practice of terrorism by non-state actors when their targets coincide. Indeed, the claim of a relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda was one of the rationales offered for the United States attack on Iraq of 20th March 2003. Finally, states can also tolerate private support from within their borders, especially financial support for terrorist groups. Irish American support for the Irish Republican Army affiliates comes to mind. Now, South Asia. Currently, the whole of South Asia from Afghanistan to Bangladesh is going through internal unrest and upheavals arising from a range of destabilizing factors, including ethnic conflicts, religious fundamentalism, and intense political polarization. Terrorism and political violence are not new challenges in South Asia. They have long been used by groups espousing a wide variety of causes, including national self-determination or separatism, both right and left-wing politics, and militant religious extremism. In many instances, the fragility of relatively young political systems and nascent democracies has also generated a permissive environment for the use of political violence. In addition, militant religious groups are exploiting local grievances and drawing on international events to promote radical and extremist causes, though the underlying objectives of many of these groups remain the capture of state power and the transformation of systems of government. The South Asian region currently faces a grave security threat due to increasing extremism and terrorist activities. The politics of violence and extremist trends in South Asia can be linked to the contradictions arising as a consequence of faulty national policies. The nature and political economy of the state have been instrumental in creating the current crisis. The South Asian states tend to operate in the interests of a coalition of classes and ethnic groups, thereby influencing development policies and distribution of resources. The pace, content, and dynamics of the uneven development patterns in South Asia are among the predominant causes of violence in the region. Besides the failure of transition to modernity among these South Asian states, political culture has also led to ethnic solidarities and identification with religion and culture. Interference from external powers and from neighboring and extra-regional elements, both governments and independent groups, has given a dangerous tilt to the existing volatile situation. With the marked rise of extremism and increasing terrorist activities, particularly in the past decade, South Asia is among the regions in the world with the highest annual number of fatalities caused by terrorist violence. Ethnic, ideological, and political conflicts pose a serious threat to stability and interstate relations. Each state faces multiple concerns, ranging from fundamentalists to ethno-political violence, which are consolidating along with the worsening socio-economic conditions. Terrorism and the rise of extremism has been occurring in South Asia for a variety of reasons, including perpetration by tyrannical and aggressive regimes and rebel groups, social injustice, ideological contradictions, religious beliefs, and foreign interference. However, deteriorating socio-economic conditions, government policies, and outside interference in all South Asian countries have been the primary factors responsible for the rise of extremism in the region. Terrorism and its political consequences have directly and visibly affected interstate relations in South Asia and have also led to destabilization in the region. Now, we will discuss factors that help terrorism to thrive in South Asia. These are supportive societal infrastructure. Supportive societal structure is the most vital and primary cause of terrorism. The supportive societal infrastructure is where society facilitates the presence of extremist ideology, religious or otherwise, its promoters and its recruits, where violence is not guilt, and where society is suppressed enough to accept extremism as a way of survival. Ungoverned, ill-governed, or undergoverned territories, a typical feature in South Asia, breed an environment of existential insecurity. Powerful groups or individuals with militant thought force the society to accept their dictate. Some of the South Asian countries, especially Afghanistan, Pakistan, and to some extent Sri Lanka, are nearly fitting into this definition. Pakistani society provides everything a terrorist organization needed, like support for extremist ideology, placing religious concerns before self, uninterrupted supply of young and committed fighters, justification of terror as the way to achieve Islamic goal, and acceptance of death of their nearer and dearer as martyr. Many popular ideas about terrorists and why they seek to harm us are fueled by falsehoods and misinformation. Leading politicians and scholars have argued that poverty and lack of education breed terrorism, despite the wealth of evidence showing that most terrorists come from middle class and often college educated backgrounds. Terrorists are not people who have nothing to live for. On the contrary, they are the people who believe in something so strongly that they are willing to die for it. Individuals, either in small groups or on their own, supply their services to terrorist organizations. Support from the state. A consensus definition on the state-sponsored terrorism is still to be evolved. Since the involvement of state in terrorism activities is difficult to prove, considering the easy deniability of each of the acts and the involvement of actors by the involved state, support from the state in the form of allowing terror groups to function, offering training through ex-servicemen, and guiding attacks is continuing unabated. International terrorism cannot survive without the active or passive support of the state, as the might of any state law is mightier than any of the terrorist organization. South Asia, with a long history of conflict, is settled to come out from the baggage of its history. Using terrorists as a state proxy to settle historical or religious scores or to achieve ulterior objectives has become an unwanted byproduct of independence from colonial rule and subsequent partition. Populated with religious zealots, two nuclear armed nations and two nuclear armed neighbors in China and Russia, South Asia is a fertile field for state-sponsored terrorism. A new trend prevalent in the region is the emergence of a complex mixture of charity with extremism, with or without state approval, the result of mutilated democratic process. Management of terrorist organization. South Asia has been the base for many terrorist organizations. The management of terrorist organizations no more remained a secretive or criminal job. Rather, the position is becoming respectable in the society. Terrorist leaders are seen as a socio-political strategic equalizer in the country. Managing a huge army of militants like the LET, Jaish-e-Mohammed and Al-Qaeda required constant flow of money, manpower, material support and protection from the state. The functioning style of these organizations has attained a surprising level of sophistication. Some of the terror organizations are also turning like a consultancy firm, offering services on payment. Militant groups in other countries of South Asia, although try to emulate the functioning style of terror groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan, their efforts have so far been stymied by state agencies. In Pakistan, militant leaders enjoy impunity from the law. During the Afghan war, Pakistani mosques and madrasas were acted as the launching pad for Afghan jihad and considered as factories producing n number of jihadi fighters. The culture of building a mosque or a madrasa, which is like starting a business outlet, is very popular in the country. The incentives for the owner, means group or individuals, of the mosque or madrasas are attractive, which include livelihood, fame, influence and most importantly position in the society. In the absence of any government restriction or regulation of foreign funding, mosques and madrasas in Pakistan has long been pampered by the Arab funding. When Pakistan has begun to debate whether the government should allow religious groups to run their own complexes with large funding from abroad, former Interior Minister of Pakistan, Lieutenant General retired Muinuddin Haider, I am quoting, "The government cannot take any action since no law has been broken," unquote. Terrorist groups like the LET get most of the recruits from 8,000 madrasas. Most are a byproduct of a crumbling state. More than 1 million youths are now enrolled in madrasas because of Pakistan's deteriorating education system and a growing appeal of Islam. South Asia, with the highest incidence of poverty, 43% of the population, view madrasas, which provide food, shelter and education, with respect. Children of poor parents gravitate towards the well-managed madrasas and terrorist organizations functioning under the garb of religion. In a secret cable, the then American ambassador in Islamabad written to her home government that, I am quoting, "We are seeing young Punjabi men turning up in Fatah and Afghanistan as fighters, recruited from areas of southern Punjab, where poverty, illiteracy and despair create a breeding ground for extremism," unquote. The management of terrorist organizations, madrasas and mosques which are imparting extremism is the root cause of terrorism. The sense of supremacy of the leader of terrorist organizations and their personal aura gained through the act of terror encourages them to sustain terrorism at any cost. Leaders of militant organizations were well aware of the fact that the more they increase their support base, the more they are immune from state law. So, there has always been the pressure for the militant leaders to recruit as many as militants as possible. Weak government, weaker political leadership and struggle for power only aiding to their ambition. After independence, South Asian states faced several challenges, among them demarcation of borders without much consideration for demographics, religious orientations and their historical antecedents that continue to persist. Weak states characterized by underdevelopment, varying ideologies, historical grievances, weak institutions and the tension of the Cold War had set the perfect storm for civil wars in the region. In the process, South Asia became home to insurgencies and terrorist activities that ranged from ethno-religious, leftist, communist, indigenous, independence struggles to religio-political movements. This culminated in South Asian states becoming origins, transits and destinations of terrorism. Now, we will discuss terrorism and security issues in South Asia and country contexts. South Asia is comprised of 8 countries: Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan and Sri Lanka. It is by any account far from a simple region. The region is characterized by a variety of religions, ethnicities, languages, customs, histories, cultures and a vast range of other elements characteristic of diversity. In the larger historical context, it has gone through various colonial conquests and controls which mark different epochs in the evolution of its constitutive countries and with remnants of those epochs still very much notable. From the various kingdoms that ancestral India once was to the Mughals, the French, the Portuguese and the English, much of the influence and impact from language to landmarks still remain. India itself up to the current times, from which later emerged Pakistan and Bangladesh, may be considered a world of its own. Its ability to preserve its ancient customs and religions exhibits vibrant practice of Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, Islam and Sikhism in addition to Christianity. These religious dimensions and cultural components have also been richly maintained in India's vast diasporic transnational settings, especially Hinduism and Islam in global contexts and Sikhism in England, Australia, Canada and the US. Yet, in some important respects, these religious dimensions have also been source of varying levels of tensions that have given rise to violent extremism and terrorism. Hindu and Sikh militancy were notable in the contemporary experience. For example, in the Ayodhya violence of 1990s over the Babri Masjid and the Khalistan movement for a separate Sikh homeland that gave rise to the Air India bombing in 1985. In the case of the latter, there was also a linkage of Sikh extremism to Canada, and there were many innocent victims of that tragedy who were Canadian. In the same way, some scholars are of the view that there was relative unity in India among the various religions before the British arrival. The splintering of Pakistan and the continued tension over Jammu and Kashmir carry strain and levels of political animosity between India and Pakistan. A significant spread of the more entrenched Islamization in Pakistan on the public level by General Zia-ul-Haq, who took over the government by coup and polarized the society away from the inclusive vision of Jinnah and had repercussions to Pakistan, the region and in some sense to the global society of the present time, may not be obvious. It hardly needs to be said, of course, that in Pakistan's evolution in the 1970s and 1980s, the nesting and usurpation of the Mujahideens to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan in order to stave off communist proliferation in the region were done by using Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency to conduct training with funding encouraged by the US and Saudi Arabia. The simple point is that the climate fomented especially by General Zia-ul Haq was strategically used by others for Cold War interests that subsequently also resulted in the birth of Al-Qaeda upon conclusion of the Afghan-Soviet War. The influence of the Taliban on certain constituencies in Pakistan as especially nurtured by its proximity to neighboring Afghanistan. The network developed by rogue elements that coordinated between the geographies of Afghanistan and Pakistan and elements nurtured by the ISI to carry out undertakings on its behalf have resulted in colossal destruction to lives and property much beyond the region through acts of terrorism. This situation, of course, has also affected innocent Pakistani civilians who continue to bear strains in other societies through labeling and stigma because of rogue hardline elements that operated in their country of origin. As with the labeling and stigma Muslims face in global settings because of the carnage carried out by fanatic criminal zealots who presented themselves as the vanguard of Islam. Pakistanis, like people of Middle East ancestry, endure a similar perception of prosecution and suspicion by virtue of their national identity or place of heritage. Thus, there are also more subtle but deeply affecting outcomes to the people's lives and liberties in a global context from terrorism and rogue groups in Pakistan. The exploitation of young minds and children in their hundreds of religious seminaries, also called madrasas, especially in the northwestern frontier and Balochistan, that function under extremists' curricula of rogue administrators, and the ISI has perpetuated the problem and naturally provides a more expensive arsenal for militancy that could be channeled for the propagation of extremism and terrorism. In the Sri Lankan context, tensions between the Sinhalese and Tamils saw decades of discontent with the rise of Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam (LTTE) for an independent Tamil homeland. Various levels of terrorism on the part of contextualizing terrorism, both the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan state ensured victimizing and displacing especially the civilian Tamil population. Here too the negative impact on human security was colossal. State targeting on the one hand and suicide bombings and other forms of destruction on the other hand carried out by the LTTE made for both a situation of carnage and vulnerability. Many Tamils in Canada and elsewhere who have fled the war and the calamities associated with it continue to be affected by the deep psychological scars from their experience. Such conditions present serious problems for human and social development and for the human security and public safety. On Easter Sunday morning on 21st April 2019, the world witnessed one of the century's biggest terror attacks. The multiple suicide bombs that ripped through 3 churches and 3 luxury hotels in Sri Lanka ended the lives of at least 259 people. The Sri Lankan government has blamed the attacks on a local radicalized group called National Tawheed Jamaat (NTJ), a splintered faction of the hardline Islamist organization Sri Lanka Tawheed Jamaat. On April 21st, NTJ's 9 suicide bombers, including a woman, struck 2 Catholic churches in and around Colombo and an evangelical church in the eastern city of Batticaloa, as well as 3 Colombo hotels frequented by Western tourists, killing at least 257 people, mostly Christian worshippers, and injuring around 500 more. It is believed that the Muslim ally nation, who had been under attack in the east and the north by the Tamil Tigers, while the tensions between Muslims and the Tamil Tigers were organic or organized by some previous governments, remains debatable. The International Crisis Group noted in a report in May 2017 that security forces were implicated in several violent confrontations between Muslims and Tamils. In the Maldives, the situation is delicate both in the religio-political sense and economic hardships endured by the Maldivians. The struggle to meet basic human needs make for a dismal outlook of life, leaving many to find inspiration in the propagandistic lure of ISIS for what is construed to be a better life. Islam is the only legally permitted religion in the Maldives. Thus, religious fervor, the political structures that enforce it, and the difficulty to live a life of a dignity in a sense orchestrate vulnerability among the people, which is exploited by ISIS recruiters and the like. Bangladesh also faces serious issues, including the emergence of militant groups, which apparently draw some adrenaline from rival religious parties. The evolution of mutated religious seminaries that harbor extremism and exploit the vulnerability of the young is also a major issue for the country, which may similarly have been spawned by poverty, corruption, and distrust in the state institutions. Rogue groups likewise exploit the social miseries and political instability to push for an Islamic state and orthodoxy of society. Of course, it would be misleading to suggest that the Bangladeshi Muslim society is driven by the vehemence and motives of Islamic militants in the country, as the majority of the country's Muslims do not share such views. Such consideration notwithstanding, the country does face problems by rogue elements that exist on the periphery. Despite its impressive economic growth and social development, Bangladesh has become a target of Islamist militancy over the past 2 decades. The intensity of militancy became bolstered with the attacks on Holy Artisan Cafe in Dhaka on July 1, 2016. As well, Bangladesh has to amicably address the issue of the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, who were eschewed in both Myanmar and Bangladesh, and whose plight leaves them in a very vulnerable conditions of subsistence and destitution. Bhutan, a Buddhist country located in the foothills of the Himalayas, is quite a peaceful society that seems immune from internal strife and safe from the threat of the Macedonian syndrome of externally instigated domestic ethnic upheavals, as in the case of Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. However, in the late 1990s, 4 separatist movements in India, the United Liberation Front of Assam, National Democratic Front of Bodoland, Bodo Liberation Tigers Force, and Kamtapur Liberation Organizations (KLO), set camps in the border areas of Bhutan. The KLO had allegedly established links between Nepalese Maoists and the Bhutan Tiger Force, a Bhutanese militant organization. Considering the threat to its internal harmony and pressure from India for allowing militant activities from its soil, the Bhutanese government launched Operation All Clear and got rid of rebels and terrorists from its territory. A number of scholars have already pointed out that acts of terrorism are especially harder on developing societies in comparison to developed ones. According to the 2019 Global Terrorism Index, South Asia has had the highest impact from terrorism since 2002. Currently, of the 10 countries most impacted by terrorism, 3, Afghanistan ranked 1, Pakistan ranked 5, and India ranked at 7, are located in South Asia. In economic terms, the impact of terrorism in South Asia translated to $5.87 billion in 2018, a significant amount as it constitutes 18% of the total global impact. Dear students, in this lecture, we discussed terrorism as a multidimensional concept with conflicting definitions and interpretations. We also discussed how terrorism is the most perplexing issue in contemporary South Asia. Following that, we also examined the causal variables that help terrorism to thrive in South Asia. Finally, we discussed the problems of terrorism and its consequences country-wise in the region. Dear students, with this I am signing off. Hope you would have enjoyed listening to this lecture. Thank you for watching it.